this computer, and we are going to start. It is 11:09. So that's wow. It is November 9th. How about that? That means we have what, about 16, 31, 41 days to Christmas. Think about it that way. 41 days to Christmas. And hopefully by then we'll have more PlayStation 5s and Xbox One or Xbox Series X's, and I'll be happier. All right, so we're going to look at some energy here. So we're going to look at energy. How many days till second semester? That would, well, let's see. So today's the 9th, about another 26 days onto that, I think. I think that you guys start second semester on the 28th of January, something like that, if I remember correctly. So you guys are getting close to there. So just think about that. You're over halfway through this semester, which is kind of nice for you guys. And you've got a nice 2-week break coming up for Christmas. So, and the other cohort's getting ready to go out in clinical affiliations. They're getting terrified. They're doing a lot of work right now. So that's what we're going to talk about is energy. So energy is probably the most, when we talk about physics, when we talk about chemistry, when we talk about pretty much any of the sciences, energy is one of the things we talk a lot about, right? We can observe energy. We know what's going on. We know that energy is being transferred from one place to another, but really energy is kind of nebulous in its own right. It's not something, it's not like you can reach out and touch energy and see it. I mean, I guess if you want to grab a hold of a like electrified fence, you could touch energy. Wouldn't suggest it, right? But in physical therapy, one of the things we're going to be focusing on, and when you guys get to neuro, which is what the other group's in, one of the big things I'm going to beat into you guys is one of the biggest concepts of physical therapy is energy conservation. Teaching patients how to use as little energy as possible to get things done. Because when you get a patient that's deconditioned, or you get a patient that's got a neuro condition like Parkinson's or multiple sclerosis or even ALS, doing something as simple as brushing your teeth. I see we got them stuck to your teeth, right? Something as simple as that can exhaust them. There's this with COVID right now, there's this malingerer syndrome, that's not malingerer, but lingering syndrome that goes on with COVID, that there are people right now that are 6 months out of getting over COVID. They've recovered, and just going to the bathroom is enough for them to need a nap because their energy is just that low. They're not producing energy. They're not using their energy effectively. Those mighty mitochondria in their cells are not functioning normally. ATP is not working. And so it's really interesting the way our bodies do this, right? And we can function on very little energy as a human being, right? I'm sure some of you have done it. You've done, how many of you have ever done like 24, 48 hours straight where you've got literally nothing left in your tank, but somehow or other you're able to pull it out, right? You're able to pull it off. Or maybe you tried to go to sleep the night before and sleep just wasn't there, and you ended up falling asleep at 5 o'clock and the alarm goes off at 6. And you get up and you're like, I've got to find the energy to get going. Maybe hit the 5-hour energy as you're going out, right? But we process energy differently. And even as individual humans, the way we use energy is different, right? Some of you can eat a whole chocolate cake and not gain a single pound. And then I look at it and gain 4 pounds because our bodies process energy totally differently, right? And it's all about the way energy is transformed and used. So work, when I say work, the first thing people think about is like that 9 to 5. Oh, I'm going 11 to 7, grinding in and out, right? The place that you go that isn't fun. But really what work is when a net force acts on an object and moves it. So that's when we do work. So really, if you're sitting at home and you're not doing anything, or you're at a job where you're literally just sitting around not doing anything, technically you're not doing work from a physics standpoint, right? So technically your boss can fire you if they want to look at it a physics way. But in reality, that work's a different kind of monster when we talk about actual work. So it's how force interacts with an object and how it moves that object, right? It's a quantifiable force. So when we talk about work, work is a net force over a distance. So the formula for work is work equals force times distance. But if you had looked at one of the previous lectures, one of the things that you learned is that force, right? Force equals mass times acceleration. So in reality, work is a mass accelerating over a distance. So in reality, work does make you mad. That's my proof right there, right? So work does cause that kind of process. And when you think about work, sometimes it does. I will say that since I've been in physical therapy, I don't feel like I've really worked a true day in my life. I actually like what I do now, and I don't consider it as much work as I used to consider when I was working, 20, 24-hour shifts doing IT stuff. So if we lift 2 loads, we do twice as much work as lifting 1 load. If we lift twice the distance, we do twice as much work, right? That's kind of the way we look at it. So if you go to the gym, you lift a barbell, getting your soul on, right? Work is done lifting the barbell. So if you lift it up and you lift it over your head, you're doing work. If you lift it twice as high, you do twice as much work. If you lift twice as much weight-wise, you do twice as much work. So that's where we get into that. I talked about, work is mass acceleration over a distance. But when you're lifting the barbell, you're doing work. But let's say I'm holding the barbell up here over my head. Am I doing work anymore? So I'm just isometrically holding it above my head. Well, is it moving a distance? No, the barbell's just sitting there. So on the barbell, in a physics sense, we're no longer doing work. But what happens the longer we hold that barbell above our heads? Our muscles are going to start quivering. We're going to start shaking, right? We're going to get exhausted because we're doing an isometric hold up there. Well, work's not being done on the barbell anymore. Work's now being done on your muscles, right? Down to those little anatomy and physiology layers with the sarcomeres, right? And the actin and the myosin moving around. So even though work's not physically done on the barbell anymore, the muscles themselves are still doing work in order to maintain that nice isometric hold and stabilize. Or as one of the students said in the previous cohort, because she couldn't say stabilize, it was stabilize. She stabilized everything, which I always thought was funny because she was going to stabilize. And one of the patients I remember she worked with was like, "You're going to stab me in my eyes?" "Oh, no, stabilize." But even here, right, when we lift stuff, if I just grab this ball and this brain, I guess it is, my stress ball vanished on my desk. If I lift this up, I'm doing work on it. But just holding it here, I'm doing no work on that actual object. But if I hold this long enough, I'm eventually going to fatigue. Even something as light as this, I'm going to eventually fatigue out. In the martial arts, when I was, again, I've studied the martial arts since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. One of the fun event or strength building exercises we had to do was stand there and hold buckets out to our side. That was loads of fun. But as you add water to that bucket and have to hold it, it gets harder and harder. I'm doing no work on those buckets. But my middle delt at that point is literally screaming at me. And same thing with my supraspinatus. They're both screaming at me going, "Oh my God, this is getting heavier and heavier." Because at the macrocellular level, work is still being done. Now, let me ask you, so have you guys learned about eccentric and concentric contractions of muscles yet? Or do you guys know about them?
Not yet.
Not yet. So a concentric contraction in the anatomy term, right? A concentric contraction is when I go against gravity. So if I take, my 12-ounce can here and do a 12-ounce curl, right? I'm lifting it against gravity. That is a concentric contraction. To lower it back down to the desk and slow it down, I'm resisting gravity, and that is an eccentric contraction. So I'm still having a contraction going on at the muscles, right? Same thing, if you've seen it at the gym, you see those guys that they're churning away at the weights, and then all of a sudden they get to their last rep, and rather than slowly and calmly putting a weight down, they drop it. They don't have eccentric control to lower that weight back down at that point, right? But even when we lower a weight and we bring maybe the barbell back down to our chest, so we're doing a chest press, we're doing work when we go this way, but we're also doing work when we're going this way because we're still resisting the force and slowing it down. If we didn't slow it down, that nice bar would come right down and just bury itself in your chest. So work is still being done because the distance is being moved. So some work's done against another force, right? If an archer is pulling back on its bowstring, the archer is actually pulling back against the elastic of the bow itself. Pile drivers or jackhammers, right? The actual head of the pile driver or the jackhammer is raised up. Work is used to lift it up against gravity, and then more work is used to push it back down to slam into the concrete or whatever you're jackhammering or pile driving, right? When you do push-ups, you're doing work against your own weight, and you're doing work both ways. Again, you're going to push concentrically to lift your weight against gravity, and then you're also going to do eccentric work as you lower yourself back down slowly, right? We've all seen those people that, I don't know what kind of push-ups they're called, but they're definitely not normal push-ups. That kind of, what I'd say, they basically are humping the ground. They're just kind of dropping back down and push themselves back up. They lack that eccentric slowing down work. And there's a lot to be said about that, because when you look at that, there's some stuff we can look at from a theoric standpoint as to why that happens. Eccentric work is a lot harder than concentric work. You get a lot more burn from doing eccentric sets than you do from concentric sets. But work's going to be used to change the speed of an object, right? If you bring an automobile up to speed or slow it down, it involves work. So work is a transfer of energy between something and its surroundings, right? We're doing a force over a distance. So the work combines the unit of force, which is a Newton, with the unit of distance, which is a meter. And it's usually the Newton meter, but it's also called the joule, right? So this just proves the more work you do, the more joules you can afford. No? No? Okay, fine. Right? So 1 joule of work is when a force of 1 Newton is exerted over 1 meter. So like lifting an apple over your head. Larger units are required to do greater work. We have kilojoules and we have megajoules, right? Kilojoules, when we're lifting weights, most of the time, weightlifters lifting in the kilojoules region. Megajoules, or we do stuff like stopping a loaded truck, or we get up to, producing energy at a power plant. It's going to be megajoules. So to kind of put this concept into focus here, let's say you're applying a 60 Newton horizontal force. You're pushing something, right? And you push it 4 meters. Well, if you push it 4 meters, your work is going to be your force, the 60 Newtons you do, over the distance you do, which is 4 meters. And that would work out to be 240 Newton meters, or 240 joules. And we're going to talk about joules specifically in a little bit when we talk about calories, when we deal with food, right? Because that's one of the things we're always worried about with our patients is, are they taking in too much and not burning enough? And that's what eventually causes them to gain weight, right? Even us, that's what causes us to gain weight, when we do less work than we take in food. So then we have power, because work is one thing and power is another. Power is where we do work over time, right? So when carrying a load up a set of stairs, you need some power. But interestingly enough, you do the same amount of work whether you walk up or run up the stairs. Right? If you're carrying a 60 Newton load and you walk up the stairs or you run up the stairs, you do the same amount of work. But if you walk up them or you run up them, the amount of power required to do that is different, because power is a time interval ratio, right? When you're talking about a high power engine, right? It does work very rapidly. An engine that delivers twice the amount of power of another engine does not necessarily produce twice the amount of work or go twice as fast. It just means the engine can do twice the work or do the same amount of work in half the time, right? when you have a car that you know, compare something, and I'm a big car guy as well, so I'm going to use a couple automotive references, and I tried to make them as simple as possible. So I apologize if you're not somebody that's interested in cars, but I try to relate this a little bit to real life. You know, a powerful engine can get the automobile up to speed in less time than less powerful, right? If you have somebody that's got a little Ford Focus versus somebody that's got, you know, a Lamborghini's obviously got a more powerful engine. It can get down the road faster. It'll also burn through more gas. Exactly. And we're going to talk about that. So Truman says, I understand what it means when certain parts are required to be tightened to a certain Newton meter, right? We're going to talk about that with torque as well when we talk about centripetal force next time. So, and what that is that's specifically so that those items, when they rate those, so Truman, when they rate your certain bolts or certain parts to a certain Newton meter, the reason they rate them at that Newton meter is they know that with the forces going on in your bike, it's not going to come undone, right? That's why in like NASCAR, again, I'm a big NASCAR fan. I wasn't very happy with this weekend. Don't get me started on it. But when they hit the wheels with the impact hammer actually has a specific track on it that knows exactly how much torque they have to deliver to each of those lug nuts so the wheel stays on. If they don't get that on long enough, the wheel's going to come loose and bad things can happen if your wheels come loose when you're driving down the road. So power is work over a time interval, right? So a unit of power is the joules per second, also known as the watt, right? Not JJ and not TJ, but just the watt. So 1 watt of power is expended when 1 joule of work is done in 1 second. We often hear things about kilowatts, right? If you look at your electric bill, a lot of your electric comes in kilowatts, right? 1,000 watts. Hopefully you're not in the megawatt range, but with as cold as I keep my apartment here, I wouldn't doubt that sometimes I reach the megawatt range. I'm really happy now. I love this weather. This is fantastic. I don't need heat. Just let the stuff cool. Just get nice and cold. So the main engines of the space shuttle, they generate about 33,000 megawatts of power, and they burn through fuel at a rate of 3,400 kilograms per second. To me, that is like it's an unfathomable amount of fuel. They're burning through 3,000 kilograms of fuel every second they go upwards. That's insane, right? That just shows how much it takes to actually get off the ground. So in the United States, though, we don't typically rate engines in the term of kilowatts, whereas over in Europe, they do use kilowatts for engines. Here we have horsepower, because of course we are going to rate our cars based upon horses. That just makes complete sense. It did back when we had, you know, cars that had 10 horsepower. Well, this car can do the work of 10 horses. That makes sense, right? Now we have things like 134 horsepower. So your car can do 134 horses worth of work going down the road. So 1 horsepower is equal to the same as 0.75 kilowatts. So if you have a 134 horsepower engine, it's a 100 kilowatt engine. So the fastest production car today is the Bugatti Veyron, right? Puts out about 1,200 horsepower. So if you convert that and you look at what it'd be over, you know, in Europe, they rated at, instead of 1,200 horsepower, they rated at 900 kilowatts. And this gets into well, which is the easier unit to measure? Again, watts and kilowatts and decawatts and megawatts are all in the base 10. So it's a little easier to still do the metric system measurements. But that's not ever going to change here. I don't think we're ever going to swap. You know, it's not like you're ever going to go down to see a Mustang down at the Ford dealership and it's going to say that it's got, you know, 145 kilowatts of engine. It's always going to have horsepower because America. So what would a car with double the horsepower of another car indicate? Does that automatically mean it's faster? So let's say I have 2 cars. Car A has 100 horsepower. Car B has 200 horsepower. Does that mean they're automatically that one with 200 horsepower is automatically faster? What do you guys think?
No, because it also depends on how much the car weighs.
There you go. Good, right? There's somebody that knows a little bit about cars, right? If that 200 horsepower car weighs 5,000 pounds, right? And the other car only weighs, 2,000, it's possible that 2,000 car is going to be lighter, right? We look at motorcycles are an excellent example of it. When you look at a motorcycle and it's like advertising that it has, 60 horsepower, and you compare that to a car, you're like, oh my God, that's pathetic. But then you realize a motorcycle weighs a few hundred pounds. And that's why those motorcycles can zip around and get hit by other people driving cars, right? It's a different type of thought process. Now, if you have two equal weight cars and you have two equal drivers and you have one having more horsepower than the other, there's a good chance the one with more horsepower will be faster, right? Because it also has to be upon who's driving it, right? If I put somebody in a stick shift car that has more horsepower, doesn't mean it's going to be faster because they might not be able to get it into gear. And stick shift is the manual transmission where you have to shift the gears itself, for those of you that have never encountered it. So looking at a forklift here, because forklifts are a great example of something having power, right? If you replace a forklift with a new forklift, right? And that forklift itself, if it has twice the amount of power, well, it can lift the same amount of load in half the time, or it can lift double the load in the same amount of time. Because again, power is rated over time. And all that is just doing your simple kind of shifting around the numbers. So if you end up with kind of double that power, you can either do double the work or complete the same amount of work in half the time. And that's when we get into stuff like efficiency and all that fun stuff as well, which we'll talk about, because we're going to talk about efficiency of engines in a little bit. So mechanical energy is kind of what we talk about most commonly, right? Mechanical energy comes in two forms. We have kinetic and we have potential. And when we talk about these two things, it gets kind of nebulous, but one of the easiest things I remember when I was studying this way back when dinosaurs roamed the earth is that kinetic energy is the energy of movement, right? Something has to move in order for kinetic energy to occur. Whereas potential energy is our stored energy, right? If I see a lot of potential in you, I see a lot of stuff that can be stored and brought out. So kinetic movement, potential, stored. And we're going to talk about the different types of each of those. So again, when Archer draws back on the bowstring, right? I saw we had a time under tension curve there, right? As that bent bow goes back, it gets the ability to do more work on the arrow. The more you pull back, the greater the tension occurs, and there's a greater chance to deliver more work to that arrow. And again, back to the pile driver idea here, spring mechanism is a great idea, right? If you have a clock or a watch that runs on a winding up spring, as you wind that up, you increase the tensile force on that spring inside whatever you're winding. And as you release that, it does work on the object. You've actually created a potential energy source in there. So something has been acquired that enables an object to do work, right? We have to have the ability, we all, even right now, just sitting where you guys are, you guys have both potential energy going on inside you and kinetic energy. And some of you can feel your potential energy too much. Like I know, especially if I sit for too long a period of time, I can feel that potential energy needing a release, right? I get a little bit hyper. It's not just my caffeine, because today I'm drinking decaf. Thank you very much. It's fake caffeine. Yep.
Mr. McKeever, sorry, what was kinetic energy again?
Kinetic energy is the energy of movement.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, we're gonna break each of them down a little bit here. So in us, right, we have compression of atoms. We have stuff pulling us. We have gravity pulling on us. We have electrical charges. All of that is providing us with energy, right? You guys go and you drink 5 Bang energy drinks. Well, they're called energy because what they're really doing is causing your cellular use of energy to go up, right? If you drink a lot of caffeine, your body gets a little bit warm, right? Sometimes you can get sick if you don't have enough something in your stomach to absorb all that lovely caffeine as well. your body's energy usage goes up. That's why you can do this before you go to the gym. You can stack caffeine and burn more calories while you're at the gym. You can also burn out your heart, but hey, you're burning more calories, so why not? So the property of an object or system that allows it to do work is energy, right? Like work, energy is measured in joules. So work and energy go hand in hand. And so we'll talk about mechanical energy as the energy due to position of something or some movement of something. So mechanical energy either involves where something's at and it's built up, pent up inside you, or movement of something, that kinetic energy, getting that energy out of you. So potential energy breaks further down into 3 different types. So potential energy is stored energy, the amount of energy stored inside you. You have elastic, you have chemical, and you have gravitational potential energies. The human body has all of those, right? How can this be an example? What would be an example of something in your body having elastic potential energy? What type of tissue?
Like a muscle.
A muscle, great. Even your bones have a little bit of elastic potential energy, right? You can bend and then they reshape. Of course, you can bend them too far and then they don't reshape, and that's called a break, right? But your muscles, they have elastic potential energy, right? We can prove that by, even if we push down too hard, if I push down on this arm here specifically, because I know I've got clonus on it, I can get an elastic reaction out of it, right? That's the muscle just kind of quivering. That's a good amount of elastic potential energy there. Chemical energy is what we rely on to power all of our cells, right? If you eat something, your body's going to take that food in. It's going to digest it. In the digestion process, it's going to break it down into sugars. And those sugars then are going to be delivered to your cells that you need this energy. And maybe if you don't need all that energy you took in, it's going to store it in adipose. Well, why do we store adipose? Well, the body's saying, well, what if tomorrow I need that energy? So that's why the body builds up kind of the adipose. The other reason is for heat and that, but we'll discuss that in anatomy itself. So we have chemical energies, the actual energy of atoms in our body. And then gravitational potential energy, the actual energy of our height, right? Where we are in space. If somebody comes along and pulls this chair out from under me all of a sudden, am I going to just stay floating in space? Probably not. I've got a little bit of mass to me. Gravity's going to pull me and I'm going to fall to the ground, right? And depending upon how far I fall will depend upon how much potential energy gets converted into kinetic energy, right? You jump off of a house and you land. Certain amount of energy is going to be absorbed by your body and you may break a bone. Now you jump out of a 10-story skyscraper, that energy is a lot different, right? You're jumping from a lot higher height. The gravitational potential energy is greater. But an object just stores energy by virtue of its position. Elastic, my muscle's at a certain length. I've got some elastic energy going on. Chemical, my mitochondria in my muscles, in my body, in my cells, storing that chemical energy up, getting ready for use, right? Think about like the sprinter getting ready to run, right? They're on their block, they're down, they're waiting for that gun to go off. And that gun goes off, all of a sudden, they're going to use all 3 of these energies to propel themselves forward. They're going to use elastic potential energy of their muscles. They're going to convert chemical energy into energy of the cells. And then they're also going to be pushing off the ground and gaining height and then pushing further when they run. So all of that is potential energy. It's energy that's stored and held in readiness, right? What happens if you give a kid too much sugar? Has anyone ever done that? Like your baby brother
Gets too hyper?
Yeah, they get hyper, right? Back when I was married, my mother-in-law and my father-in-law had an oops baby, is what they called him. You know, she was 42 and he was 51 and didn't think they could have a kid. And well, guess what? Surprise, oops, it happened. So we babysat him the one day. And, you know, he used to love to come over to our house because he got to play Thomas the Tank Engine on my computer. That was his big thing he did. And I was fine because in the mornings I usually had to do work. And so I'd sit him over there. He'd play some Thomas Tank Engine because this was the kind of kid that kind of loved to get up at like 4 o'clock in the morning. And he's sitting there, and all of a sudden I'm working and I hear, good, Keithy. Good. Good. What are you doing? And I look over, and he has my mug of coffee, and my mug was literally like a 44-ounce mug, and he's just downing my coffee. And he was like 3 years old. About an hour later, he's sitting there in the chair going, I don't feel well. And he's literally bouncing back and forth because now all that potential energy is kicked up in his body. And so what do? You take him out and run. He went out and we went to the playground. He ran around for a while and then crashed hard. Right? That happens to you guys if you have too much, right? What happens if you take something like a 5-hour energy or a Bang energy drink? And then in about 2 hours, you have that reverse crash, right? Where your blood sugar kind of dips down. And then until everything levels off, you kind of feel like crap. That's because your potential energy reserves are down. That chemical energy is not stored as much in your body. So elastic is the stretched or compressed idea for potential energy, right? When a bow is drawn back, energy is stored in the bow. The bow can do work on the arrow. Stretched rubber bands, another great example of elastic potential energy. Even the stress ball here that I'm using, right? If I squeeze it, I'm doing some work on that stress ball by compressing it. As soon as I let it go, it pops out, right? Because I've changed its elastic potential energy and it pops out. Elastic, when you talk about the term of elasticity, it's the ability to return to its own shape, right? If I squeeze this down and it didn't return to its own shape, it would be inelastic, right? So I've got paper here on my desk. I can take paper and do the same thing here. Now, if paper is elastic, when I let go of it, what should happen? It should just flip right back out to a piece of paper, right? But paper doesn't have a good elasticity. It stays all crumpled up as garbage at that point. Or when I had a cat toy, right? Because you can buy cats all kinds of expensive toys. They're going to play with a ball of paper over everything. So potential energy, when we're talking about things that are stretched or compressed, is elastic. Chemical is energy in fuels, basically the energy of the submicroscopic level. It's that energy of the electrons moving in something. It's the available position of electrical charges. It's the space in between molecules. It's what attracts and repels electrons and molecules, right? You've learned that with magnets, right? The same poles repel, opposites attract. That is stored chemical energy in that actual cell. And then gravitational is work required to required to elevate objects against Earth's gravity. The higher up an object is, the greater its potential energy. And we talked a little bit about that when we talked about dropping pennies and stuff like that off of a high skyscraper or off the stratosphere downtown, right? If you drop something from that height, you can really hurt somebody down at the bottom because that object that you dropped has gained a ton of potential energy, right? So at the very top, when I take this little brain here, where you can see it, at this point, everything in this brain is potential energy. As it drops through space, if I let it go and it falls and it falls and it falls and it falls and it falls, it's gaining more kinetic energy because it's converting that gravitational energy into kinetic. It's moving faster and faster and faster and faster and faster. So even looking at something like the Hoover Dam, right? When you go down to the Hoover Dam, if you look at Lake Mead and the reservoir, it's at a higher level than where the river exits the bottom of the Hoover Dam, right? Well, why is that? Well, because they want the water to flow down through the sluices, because as the water falls, it's going to gain energy. And as that energy falls and falls and falls and gains more and more, it's going to go down and hit propellers and spin those propellers. And those propellers spinning are going to create energy. And that's what gives us all our bright lights here in Vegas, right? We have a lot of our energy comes from the Hoover Dam. If we didn't have that, electricity in this city would be pretty expensive. Just because the only other option we'd have is putting in more coal plants, right? Now we're getting more solar, we're getting smarter. So putting some more solar in is pretty smart, right? But think about it. If we didn't have the hydroelectric plant, and we didn't have some coal backup, and we didn't have the solar that we have now, we'd have to ship energy in from, say, Phoenix or from LA. And that energy getting shipped into us actually causes the rates to go up. So that's kind of the gravitational energy that we're using at the Hoover Dam actually does help us with our electric rates in this town. It doesn't mean that they're always that great. They're still expensive, but it does help us. So the amount of gravitational energy that an object has potentially is based upon its height. It's also going to be based upon how much that object weighs. Now, the gravitational pull is never going to change unless we change planets. Now, if we go up in height, like if we go up to something like Mile High City versus Louisiana, does that gravitational constant G change? Yeah, it changes a little bit, but a negligible amount when we're on Earth. Now, if we go from here to Jupiter, that gravitational constant changes drastically, right? If you go try to stand on Jupiter as a human being, you're probably going to be squished because Jupiter has a huge mass, so therefore it has a huge amount of gravity. But here on Earth, we just use that gravitational constant, right? That 10 meters per second squared. So if I have a mass, if this thing weighed 1 kilogram, right? And I dropped it, depending upon how high I dropped it from, it can tell me how long it drops for and how much energy it has in it. So that potential energy can be converted then into kinetic energy. And we'll talk about that when we get to kinetic energy. But if I just have it up here, if this weighs 1 kilogram, I can multiply that times the gravitational constant of 10. And then I can measure, this is about 1 meter high, right? So I have about 10 joules of energy in this just by dropping it. And it's above a reference level. I can change my potential energy here because so I'm here and it's falling to my desk. If I come out over here, now I've changed this potential energy because now I'm holding it above the floor and the floor is probably another meter down. So if I'd let it go, it would fall even further. Therefore, it would have more potential energy. So when you're thinking of a plane crash, right? If you've ever seen any movies or whatever, hopefully you've never been involved in one, right? But if you ever see any of the movies where they talk about plane crashes, one of the first thing a pilot does is tries to bring the plane down to a lower level, right? You're up at 35,000 feet cruising along, and suddenly the plane's going to crash. It's better to bring it down slowly and have less of a distance between the plane and the ground, right? To reduce the energy that's going to be released when the plane hits. If that plane falls straight from 35,000 feet and hits the ground, that's not going to be a plane, it's going to be a crater, right? Because there's not going to be anything left. There's a whole new theory right now in, weapons development for the government and stuff, where the future of weapons may not even be missiles and lasers and everything like that. It may be something as simple as a tungsten rod. Because if you could get a tungsten rod on a satellite and fire that tungsten rod towards Earth, that it had enough force to go through, whoops, I hit the speaker or the microphone, had enough force to go through the Earth's, atmosphere and come straight down, it's going to have a huge amount of force by the time it strikes the Earth's crust. It have very little propellant, but it's just a simple rod. So, space warfare is not that far off when we talk about maybe needing something like a force that goes into space, like the Space Force. So let's look at an example here, right? So here we have a boulder, right? And it's 100 newtons, right? Whether it's sitting on that top shelf, wherever it is, no matter what, its potential energy is all the same because it's 2 meters off the ground, right? So 100 Newton boulder at 2 meters off the ground, it's 200 joules. That's its potential energy, right? When you move the boulder, depending upon how you move that boulder where it is, it might require greater amounts of force to get it to where it's going. But once you get it to that height, the potential energy doesn't change, right? If I lift this up with one hand versus lifting up with two hands, the amount of energy I use to get it to that height may change. But once I get it to the height, it's the same amount of gravitational potential energy no matter how it gets there. So how much work's done on the boulder? Well, we know that work itself is force over a distance, right? So we end up with about 100 Newton meters or 100 joules. What if we lift the boulder in time of 2 seconds? Well, then we'd be running through 50 watts of energy. But relative to its starting position, if it started down here and it's now here, it's moved 2 meters up. So the potential energy of the boulder is still 100 joules. It hasn't changed, right? Relative to some other reference level, if we talked about maybe knocking out the ground and dropping another 2 meters, that would change its potential energy value. Because potential energy value is based upon how high up an object is. Same idea here. If I'm sitting in this chair right now and somebody comes and pulls this chair out from under me, I'm going to land on my tailbone on the floor. Now I've got a nice concrete floor under this carpet. It's not going to feel good. But if I instead take my chair and raise it up, now I've changed my potential energy of my body. So if now somebody pulls the chair out from under me, I am actually going to hit the floor with greater energy because I'm at a higher height. And it's potential that that little difference could end up causing me a spinal fracture. You'll hear about that a lot with older folks where they just sit down and they fracture their spine. So when we talk about hydroelectric plants, right, they use potential energy. So a large chunk of our energy, again, comes from the Hoover Dam. Water flows from the upper reservoir along a long tunnel and drops down and gains energy, gains energy, gains energy, then spins a little turbine, right? And then power stations will use some of that electricity they've stored up to pump water back up to the reservoir so that reservoir water can fall back down. If they didn't pump some of that water back up, the reservoir would eventually dry out. So we need to have some of that pumping going on. And we can actually see that right now. If you go look at the area around the Hoover Dam, you look at Lake Mead, back when I moved out here years ago, that water level in Lake Mead was a lot higher. Right? Have any of you been out to it recently and seen how far the silt levels on the walls have dropped? It's down a considerable amount. So does that mean potentially we could eventually not be able to get energy from the Hoover Dam? What do you guys think? If it drops low enough. Yeah, we could. Right? Eventually we may have to be looking for other energy, which is why we're looking at solar, which is why we're looking at wind out here, because we can't constantly count on the Hoover Dam. Now we also have to worry about, are we going to have enough water to survive here as well? But that's beside the point. We're in the desert. So kinetic energy, that's the energy of movement, right? Kinetic energy of a moving object is equal to the work required to bring it to speed from rest, or the work of an object we can do while being brought to rest. So whether we're speeding up an object or slowing down an object, we're going to be using kinetic energy. The kinetic energy of a moving object is equal to the work required to bring it to speed from rest, or the work used to bring it back to rest. So kinetic energy is actually 1/2 the mass of an object times the velocity or speed squared. So when we're looking at that, right, the velocity is a much more important factor than the mass of an object when we're talking about kinetic energy, because the velocity itself is squared. So if we have two different objects, that one is, 1 kilogram and the other object is 2 kilograms, it's going to have an effect on its kinetic energy if they're moving at the same speed. If I have you have two 1 kilogram objects, but I have the one going twice as fast, that energy and the kinetic energy that object has is actually 4 times greater, because 2 squared is 4. So that's the major object here. When you're looking at kinetic energy, this velocity is probably one of the most important factors. That's why when we look at car crashes, right, the speed that a car is going can really directly affect how bad an accident occurs. So when you throw a ball, you do work on it to give it speed as it leaves your hand. The moving ball then can hit something, push it, doing work on what it hits. So understanding this is a really kind of high level physics. When you can understand the difference between energy, momentum, and kinetic energy, that's really high level physics. We're not going to go that far. So I'm not going to try to get you guys to like quantum mechanic physics. Please, no. That was really brutal of a class. I don't want to go there ever again, right? But like I talked about, the speed of an object at this point where we're dealing with kinetic energy is squared. So if the object is doubled, the kinetic energy is quadrupled, and I really messed up. That should be 2 squared, which equals 4. So let's look at this real quick. So if I have, right, so kinetic energy is measured in joules, just like everything else, right? So kinetic energy equals 1/2 the mass of an object times its velocity squared. If I have a 1 kilogram object, and it's moving at, 1 meter per second or whatever, that's squared. 1 squared is 1 times 1 is 1. I hope you realize that. Times 1/2 is 1/2. So we've really only got about half of a joule. Right? Now, if we change that and we double that speed, so instead of 1 there, we change that to 2. So now 2 squared is 4. 4 times 1 is 4 times 1/2, right, is 2 joules. So we went from just doubling the speed, we've gone from 1/2 a joule to 2 full joules because of that squaring. It's 4 times as much. So that velocity, again, is probably one of the most important factors when we're talking about kinetic energy, right? An object moving twice as fast takes 4 times as much work to stop. So force over distance equals 1/2. Again, this is the same thing we're talking over here in joules, equals 1/2 mv squared. Why are we talking about this? Well, whenever work is done, energy is going to change form. And we're going to talk about the conservation of energy. One of the things of conservation of energy is energy isn't created, isn't destroyed, it just changes form. All of the energy, somebody talking?
Yeah, I just had a quick question, sorry to interrupt you. So on the last slide is the kinetic energy and basically the 2, or I guess the 3 formulas, are those all finding the same thing?
They really are, yeah. So when we talk about potential, we talk about kinetic. They're going to eventually equate out to the same thing, right? If I have gravitational potential energy here and I drop it, it's going to be converted into kinetic energy because it's now moving, right? So I can actually figure out that I can know when it's getting down to the bottom of the thing before it strikes anything, the kinetic energy is going to be equal to my gravitational energy at the very peak. Does that help? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. So if we increase kinetic energy of an object, work has to be done, right? We have to bring an object up to speed or bring it to rest. Work has to be done. That's the change in kinetic energy, right? This funky pyramid here, or diamond, or not diamond, triangle, there's the word. I do math good, right? That is the delta sign. Whenever you see a delta in math or science, or even when we talk about physical therapy, when we're looking at research, delta is the change in, right? The change in kinetic energy. So whenever we do an object when we do work on an object, the energy is not going to be created nor destroyed. It's literally just going to change form. It can change from potential energy to kinetic energy. It can change from kinetic energy back to potential energy and heat. We're going to find out that when we look at something like a bicycle tire and stuff. So if there's no change in object kinetic energy, then no work was done on it, right? If you push a box on the floor, if it doesn't slide, you're not doing any work. You push a desk, if I'm pushing against this desk right now, if I'm not moving the desk, again, because work is force over distance, I'm not doing any work. I'm not changing its kinetic energy. If I reduce the friction, if I put little sliders under my desk, or if suddenly I'm pushing on an ice rink, I can increase the object's kinetic energy and get it going faster and faster as I do more work against it. But even on an ice rink, some of my work that I'm doing is going to be lost due to that friction, right? That frictional force is going to reduce some of my energy. So I may deliver 10 joules of energy in an object, but it may take me 12 joules of energy to do it. Well, I'm losing some of that energy to friction. And whenever you move furniture around your house, you can feel this. You feel like you've done a ton of work and you're looking and going, wow, I moved that thing 5 feet. Well, yeah, the problem is you've had to overcome friction, which is absorbing some of that work you're doing on that furniture. Even when you do something as simple, we talk about patients and doing housework, even something as simple as vacuuming for a patient that is severely deconditioned, they're going to, because they are now having to overcome the weight of that vacuum, pushing against the friction of the floor. Just vacuuming a small room can be enough to completely exhaust a patient because they've done so much work to do that small amount of an area because they don't have the strength and the power to overcome that work. But again, energy itself doesn't really change form. It doesn't disappear or appear. And we'll talk about that when we talk about energy of our bodies and energy of the universe and everything like that. All the energy that's here, that is here, that has ever been here, that will ever be here, has been here forever. Right? When we pass away and we're put into the ground, any potential chemical energy we have is going to be transferred to the ground. That ground is then going to be transferred to plants. Plants are going to grow. Those plants are going to grow. Insects are going to eat on that. So it's just that whole, was it the cycle of life from The Lion King, right? So the more
another question. So
yes.
if you're just standing, does that mean that it just gets converted into like potential energy?
Yeah, right at if we're just standing here, right? Most of our body is going to be using just potential energy. Now, do we have some kinetic energy going on? Sure, we actually do, because if you look down at the muscular level, some muscles are moving, right? And that's to keep us up against gravity. If those muscles didn't have some micro contractions going on, we just go and collapse into the ground, right? We have to resist gravity in order to stand up. But most of it's stored energy. And that's why I really like that idea of like that sprinter getting ready to sprint. Or even like if you watch football, right? An offensive lineman with his knuckle in the ground getting ready to take off when the ball's hiked. All that just sitting there not doing anything, all that potential energy is just stored up and then is delivered out as movement occurs, right? So that potential energy then can be converted. But even in the case of a runner, when a sprinter is going to run down the track, every time their foot hits the track, friction's occurring. So they're losing some of the energy, that kinetic energy, that potential energy they had to friction as well, which friction generates heat, which means we're never going to be 100% efficient, right? As long as there's friction, we'll never be 100% efficient. In the vacuum, we have a chance to be 100% efficient because we may not have friction there. Does that help? Does that make sense? Am I speaking foreign languages yet?
No, that makes sense.
I'm starting to think I speak in tongues occasionally. energy is transferred like we have a, so this is showing a picture of a bike, right? So this is your old classic bicycle and you stomp on the brakes. As you stomp on the brakes, it's going to require work to be done to slow down that bike. And how can you look at that? How do you know that? Because it's going to be going friction's what's slowing it down. If you look at the bike and you flip the bike over and look at the wheel under a thermal camera, there's usually going to be a spot on that tire that's going to be hot. But at the same time, if you look at the road where it was happening, there's going to be a spot that's hot. As a human, right? If you're laying in bed, even just laying in bed, not doing anything, your cells are still moving around, right? You're digesting food. You know, even lying in bed, you're never 100% just lying there dead to the world. You've still got some twitches going on and stuff like that. If you get up out of that bed and you were to take a thermal camera and aim it at the bed itself, you would see heat transfer from your body, right? If it didn't show transfer heat, then you're a vampire. And I can't help you there. Sorry. I'll just get out the garlic. Please stay away from me. I like living. So when a car brakes, the friction force applied by the brakes multiplied by the distance over the friction is how the car stops. A car moving at twice the speed has 4 times the amount of kinetic energy and requires 4 times the amount of work to stop it. So friction can be the same for both cars, but the kinetic energy required to stop it is based upon its velocity, the speed it's going. Right? That's why, how can we change and slow down a car faster? Well, we can change its brakes. Right? Back when I was, you know, back when I was young, all of our cars had rear drum brakes, which were the biggest pain in the butts to change. Right? We've pretty much now moved on to mostly disc brakes. Why? Because those drum brakes weren't as efficient as our disc brakes that we have now. Plus, we've got stuff like we're talking here of anti-lock brakes to keep things from completely locking up. But here we're looking at 3 cars, right? Now we're assuming these cars at the bottom are all of the same mass, right? So that's not changed. But when you look at them, this car going 45 kilometers per hour skids about 10 meters, right? If you double the speed the car is going, it skids 4 times as long. Why is that? Well, that's because 1/2 mv, and that squared is the important part. So that velocity has a great amount to do with it. Well, how could we take this car that's going faster and get it to slow down better? Well, we could improve its brakes, right? And you look at cars like Indy cars, NASCAR, anything like that, their brakes are huge. And the amount of force that those brakes can apply on each side of the brakes is greater than just your average ordinary car, right? Tractor trailer trucks, another great example. Their brakes have to be huge because they're carrying so much more mass. But what's more dangerous? A tractor trailer truck that's empty going 2 times as fast, or a tractor trailer truck that's full going 1/4 the speed? That tractor trailer truck that's traveling at that faster speed is actually more dangerous because that velocity is squared. It has a lot more kinetic energy to deliver. So if that truck hits you, you have a greater chance of being injured in a car accident. If somebody slams into you from behind, right? And this never happens in Vegas, right? No one ever gets rear-ended in Vegas. That never happens. The best option you can hope for is that car is traveling at a slow rate of speed. The slower it's traveling, the less kinetic energy is going to be imparted upon you. So what's going to happen? Those cars combine together, right? This car has kinetic energy, you're stopped. So you are all potential energy. That car comes careening into you, slams into you, it's going to deliver part of its kinetic energy to move you forward. The other thing it's going to do is create friction between the cars, and the cars are going to crumple together. And there's going to be heat transfer there. So there's going to be heat given off by that accident. It can also theoretically increase the potential energy of your car and cause you to have further damage, right? Because the car itself then just starts kind of crumpling up and gets destroyed. Now that car, instead of going 5 miles an hour, is now traveling at 50 miles an hour. That kinetic energy to stop that car is going to be a lot greater. And your car sitting there just with all potential energy may not have enough to stop that car, and literally can push you into the middle of the intersection, and then all worse things will happen. That velocity or that speed that vehicles travel at is by far more deadly in car accidents than necessarily the mass of the car. Now let's think about something. If I'm sitting in my not my trailer truck, but my big old Toyota Tundra, right? My Tundra's got a lot of weight to it. It's half-ton pickup truck. Now, in comes a Kia Rio and slams into the back of my Toyota Tundra. My Tundra has more mass, right? And it's sitting, we can calculate its gravitational potential energy just sitting there on the road. It's got a certain amount of potential energy. What would it take for that Rio to move me? Well, it would have to exceed the amount of potential energy that my truck has sitting at rest in order to move the truck. Otherwise, it'll just kind of come in, and most of that energy will be redirected back into the car hitting me. You know, I might feel a little bump. I'll get out, and the car behind me is an accordion. That's kind of how car accidents can be really dangerous because of that change in kinetic energy. And I'm going to have to stop here because you guys need a break before your anatomy class. So we'll stop it here. We'll pick this up on Wednesday.